If I wanted to murder someone, would that be wrong? And if so, why? Some would say that murder just is wrong, and some would say that maybe people have a right not to be murdered. But there is a group of people who would say that this would be wrong because of the suffering it causes. And if you're one of these people, then congratulations, you're a utilitarian. Utilitarianism is a theory that was founded by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and it basically says that the moral course of action is the one that produces the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of suffering. So the greatest good for the greatest number. And at first sight, this might seem like a pretty solid moral theory. I think it's one of the most popular moral theories, and definitely the most popular among non-philosophers. It's quite straightforward, and I mean, choosing the action that produces the most pleasure instead of the one that produces the most suffering seems pretty reasonable, right? Who could really argue with that? Well, I could, and that's what I'm going to do in this video. Because even though utilitarianism at a surface seems like a really good theory, I think it has some major flaws, and I wanted to discuss these in this video. So the first one is that even if utilitarianism was a good theory in theory, it still wouldn't be very applicable in reality. First, it might seem really straightforward. If I want to murder person X, it's quite obvious that I shouldn't do that. It would cause more suffering than pleasure. But what if he would go on to murder 2 people if I didn't murder him? Would it be right for me to murder him then? Or maybe he wouldn't. Maybe he would be a really good citizen, help a lot of people, create so much pleasure, but then go on to have a daughter who will just be such a bad person, create so much suffering that it just outweighs the good that not murdering him will cause. And then it would be moral for me to murder him. Actions have so many consequences that are really unpredictable. We see this all the time in history. Small things that you might have thought were good ideas then, can have catastrophic consequences. Things that no one would really be able to see coming. This means that if utilitarianism is right, you wouldn't be able to know whether you were acting morally or not. Even then, something that might be good in one lifetime will have detrimental consequences 100, 200, 1,000 years afterwards. And so in order to know which consequences that is going to be the moral one, you would have to have complete knowledge of everything that is to come, complete knowledge of the future, in order to know all of the consequences of one action. This means that if we were to accept utilitarianism and say this is the moral principle to follow, we wouldn't really know what to do. Even in very straightforward cases. Take the trolley problem, for example. It seems so obvious that you would create more pleasure, or at least reduce the amount of suffering by saving 5 people and sacrificing 1 person. But I don't know if we can be so confident. And this is in a very fixated, very special scenario, just in our everyday lives. No, that would be impossible. And of course, if you're a moral realist and think that something like pleasure just is intrinsically good, then maybe you would just bite the bullet here and say, you know what? Maybe we wouldn't be able to know whether we were acting morally or not. That doesn't change the fact that the action that has produced the most pleasure and reduced the amount of suffering will have been the moral action. Just that I guess you will have to live with the fact that you don't know if you've been acting morally or not. I'm not a moral realist. I think morality is something that more so exists between humans, that exists socially, in social settings, as a way for us to live together, to coexist, to communicate and to create a society together. And so a moral system that you wouldn't be able to use, I think it's a pretty useless moral system, I think. And I don't think it's one that you should adopt. But of course, this is coming from a anti-realist perspective. Though, I suppose you could be an anti-realist utilitarian as well. For example, by acknowledging that pleasure isn't intrinsically good and suffering isn't intrinsically bad, but it is intrinsically good and bad for us as humans. It's something that we value, and since we have a choice on how to act, it's reasonable for us to act in a way that maximizes what we find good and reduces what we find bad. So I do suppose you won't have to be a moral realist to be a utilitarian. That said, given my first point, it still doesn't change the fact that you wouldn't be able to know which action were moral and which one isn't. So even if we were to adopt the utilitarian principle, I think we would inevitably have to have some kind of substitute principle just to know how to act. And I suppose that is where rule consequentialism comes in. Of course, that has its own problems, though I do prefer rule consequentialism to just straight up act consequentialism, which is what most people think of when they think of utilitarianism, which I suppose is an umbrella term because both rule consequentialism and act consequentialism can be utilitarian moral principles or moral theories. Of course, you cannot have a critique of utilitarianism without reductio ad absurdum. A lot of you might be familiar with the organ transplant dilemma. Basically, you have one healthy person, 5 people needing a organ transplant, and you could harvest the organs of this healthy person, save the 5 people. From a utilitarian perspective, you should harvest organs, but a lot of people want to say, no, I think you have a right to not have your organs harvested without your consent. I do, however, think that this is possibly one of the nicer reductio ad absurdum, one that has milder consequences. And the dilemma that I like to put forward is instead you have 100 sadists and 1 5-year-old in a room. And these sadists would feel a lot of pleasure by torturing this 5-year-old. And is it moral for you to torture the 5-year-old? And from a utilitarian perspective, yes. And of course the utilitarian could say, well, the suffering from the 5-year-old being tortured wouldn't outweigh the pleasure the sadists are feeling, but then you could just keep on increasing the number of sadists until you will have to either bite the bullet and say, well, yes, you should. That is the moral thing to do. Torture the 5-year-old. Or you will have to say, you know what? I don't think pleasure is the best metric of which to measure morality. And obviously, I've taken the second route. Again, if you are a moral realist and you are like a hedonistic moral realist, you would just bite the bullet on all these different reductio. I mean, there are so many ones when it comes to utilitarianism. The utility monster, I think, is like a fun one. It's a bit different. Basically about if you were to have like this big utility monster that basically feels pleasure and pain like 100 million times as strongly as we do, then the moral thing would basically be to just spend all our time and resources trying to make this utility monster happy. Maybe keeping us alive just to serve this utility monster. The utilitarian often says that, well, that's just a fictional scenario, that wouldn't happen. We don't have a utility monster here. But I do think it's a creative one. But yeah, my favorite favorite. Utilitarianism dilemma would probably more so be the sadist one. But yeah, if you are a moral realist, you would just bite the bullet. As I said, I'm not. And if a moral system leaves you with conclusions that you just wouldn't want, a moral system that doesn't represent what kind of society we want to live in, then I don't think that's a good moral system. Because as I said, morality is something between humans. It's not something that exists out there as a undeniable metaphysical truth. It's something social. It's something, as I said, between humans, between ourselves. In here, it exists in here, not out there. I do still think it's interesting, utilitarianism, because as I said, it's probably one of the most popular moral systems among people who aren't that into philosophy. I mean, there are a lot of philosophers who are utilitarians, Peter Singer, for example. So there are educated, smart people who are utilitarians, but among just the average Joe, I think this is definitely the most popular moral theory if you just were to ask someone, how should you act? And most people would probably say, act to make as many people happy as possible and as few people sad as possible. Seems like a good principle, and I think it is many times. Just in our everyday lives, aside from philosophy, just in how many try to act when organizing a birthday party, trying to decide with which cake to choose, you probably will choose the one that the most people like. And so I do think that it's really a common sense type of theory that first, spontaneously, intuitively feels right. But as I said, when you dig a little deeper, you get some really troubling consequences and just problems. And my biggest problems are the ones that I mentioned in this video, even though there are a lot of other critiques of utilitarianism as well. But I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts are on this, so please feel free to comment that and let me know what you think of utilitarianism. Thank you so much for listening. Have an amazing day.